urban forestry. He has served with the Forest Service as a county arborist and an arboricultural consultant. For the past 20 years, he has directed the Southern Region Urban Forestry Program for the Forest Service, where he administers grants and educational programs to help states deliver urban forestry to their communities. He also strongly supports urban forestry research and science delivery, having established the Center for Urban Forestry Research in Athens, Georgia, and the Southern Research Station Center for Wildland Urban Interface Research and Information in Gainesville, Florida. He has a background, or his background includes a bachelor's degree in environmental science through environmental arboriculture from the University of California, Davis, and a master's in urban forest ecology from State University in New York. And with that, we can get started with your presentation, Ed. I'll click that over for you. So now I'm going to mute my line, and you've got control, Ed.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. Please let me know if you have any sound quality issues. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us with this webinar. This is a basic presentation on tree protection ordinances, and what I hope to do is accomplish these four objectives. Number one, identify some various common components of a typical tree protection ordinance and review some key elements within those ordinance, within this type of ordinance, but I intend to spend a lot of time discussing the mechanics and the characteristics of a successful tree ordinance, and I'll be drawing on one local ordinance in particular, the city of Decatur, which is a small city, 4 square miles, but it's got a very high population density of about 19,000 people with a lot of development pressure. So I thought this is, being a small town, but under a lot of development pressure would be a good case study to look at. And then I'm going to get towards the end talk about some keys to the ordinance adoption process, because that's an area where I see a lot of communities running into difficulties and trouble. So the first question communities ask is, when do we adopt an ordinance, and why, or why should we not adopt an ordinance? My experience is usually something catastrophic might happen in a community that wakes a lot of people up, and there's all of a sudden a sense of urgency. The picture in the upper left is one of those catastrophic events. A big box developer will come in and knock down 30 or 40 acres of trees, and come back with the scene that you see on the right photo on the top, which is 30 or 40 acres of asphalt and concrete, and it shocks people sometimes. A lot of communities in the South are going through what we call housing renewal. Old houses are being demolished, and a lot of times they're small houses on medium-sized lots with very large trees. The trees grew into their surroundings, and builders are knocking these houses down and putting up starter mansions, and with very limited space. And so, as you see the picture on the bottom right, you have a large house coming on a small lot with very large trees, and the impact is substantial, and builder walks away, and eventually the trees will die within a year or 2 years from construction-related damages. So these types of events motivate communities to adopt tree ordinances and tree protection ordinances in particular, and move into the process that we're going to discuss this morning. One thing that tree ordinances do not do, and some communities make this mistake, is that they think of tree ordinances as growth management tools, and they're not. The tree protection ordinance is an ordinance. It's a tool to help a community maintain forest canopy as they're going through land use change. Growth management tools can help complement the tree protection ordinance process, but tree protection ordinances cannot manage growth. So that's a little trap door that you could fall through if you're not being careful. Ordinances are structured in various ways, but I've found over the years that it's most desirable to have a two-document processed approach. One would be the regulatory document, which is the ordinance itself, which basically describes what the community intends to do with their trees and land development and building construction. And then the second half is the administrative approach. It's a separate document, not part of the tree ordinance, but it's a set of administrative standards or procedures or best management practices that helps in an instructional way. It helps the community, including the land development community, the builders and contractors, work through the tree protection process. So the regulatory document is a set of rules, and the administrative document is the how-to or the standards. I found that this approach is very effective because trees are complicated biological organisms, and the land development and building construction process is very rigid in some ways. So you're bound to run into conflicts between the two. And taking an administrative approach towards enacting your ordinance will allow you a greater degree of flexibility. Sometimes you just have to be able to make field decisions. General sections of an ordinance, I'm sure many of you have seen all of these. Every ordinance starts with a set of findings that define the purpose and the intent of the ordinance. Very often what those findings do is it ties in the enabling authority that the community has. They have to be enabled by the state legislature to pass these kind of laws. And findings a lot of times also go through some form of legal review. And then the ordinance will establish a set of definitions just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And then finally, a set of applicability and exemptions. And that's to whom the ordinance applies to or not. So I'm going to switch now from this PowerPoint presentation, share my desktop so I can show you what the Decatur tree ordinance looks like with some of these sections. This is the Decatur tree ordinance. Leslie, please tell me that you're seeing this.
Ed, you've probably got it on a different monitor. Did you got two monitors running?
No, I only have one monitor running.
Oh, okay. Well, there it's finally appearing. We want to see the left half.
I'm sorry. Say that again, Dudley.
Oh, I'm sorry. You've got a very narrow window. Yeah, we can see it now.
Do I need to move one way or the other?
No, I think we got everything. I mean, we're only seeing the left column of that paper.
Oh, okay. That's kind of strange. Does it help when I go like that?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Well, so can you see the entire document now?
Not yet. It's pretty slow here too. I don't know how it is for everybody else. There, now you're good.
Okay. Well, this is the Decatur tree ordinance, and what I'm scrolling through slowly is the definition sections that I mentioned earlier on. And the definitions in these ordinances do get pretty detailed. For example, here's the definition of damage. I've been on sites where I've had arguments that the tree's been damaged, and the builder would say, no, I didn't damage that tree. All I did was cut this trench 10 feet from it, but I didn't get any roots. So the damage definition is pretty clear: any harmful injury to a tree or any of its parts, including roots. So detail is pretty important when we're working through the definitions, because you do end up in discussions and you want to make sure that there's some pretty good clarity. I'm going to scroll down a little further to the applicability section because I think the City of Decatur presented it very well. What they do is show the type of property who the ordinance might apply to. In this case, it's commercial, which is all zoning districts except a couple of high-density residential that they're showing. And then they're showing the type of activity and then what's required in a very nice tabular format. So if you're in a commercial district and you want to remove a tree, you have to present the city a tree conservation plan, and you must have a tree removal permit.
Not to interrupt you real quick, if you could reduce the size of it. Right now you have it at 258%. It's really hard on our end to see the whole page.
Okay, sure.
That might help everybody see what it is you're talking about.
How's that? Is that better?
It's a little bit better. I still only see a couple of columns, but for a couple of rows.
I'm sorry. How about that?
That's better. That's better.
Okay. So backing up again, this is the applicability spreadsheet that the city uses, showing, if you can see my cursor, the property type, and then the second column is the type of activity that's occurring within that property, and the third column is what's required of the applicant. This is presented in a really nice format. I haven't seen too many tree ordinances that follow this approach, but it makes identifying what's required very easy. Okay, I need to flip back now, Leslie, to the presentation. Can you do that for me? Okay. So we've talked about findings, definitions, and applicability and exemptions. The next set of general sections include general requirements. That was the third column in the spreadsheet that I just showed you. And these requirements generally pertain to tree preservation, replacement, coverage requirements, and hopefully, I'd like to see ordinances also having landscape and parking lot requirements. Now, I underscore tree replacement. I think it's really important. The word I use is imperative, that your ordinance also includes some pretty substantial tree planting requirements. A lot of times it's just not practical, especially when you're working with big box stores, commercial districts, or high density residential, that it's sometimes just not feasible to save trees on sites. It just can't be done. So if you have a robust tree replacement program as part of your tree protection ordinance, it really becomes more of a tree conservation ordinance, and you're guaranteeing yourself better canopy cover in the future. So you have to take the long view on that. And so along with that is the coverage requirement, establishing some standard for bringing back a minimum amount of tree coverage on a site. Continuing on with sections, every ordinance should have an appeals process or some way to waive requirements or reverse decisions, because nothing is absolute out in the real world when you're dealing with biology and construction. Enforcement, violation, and penalties is also a typical section in an ordinance. I seldom see enforcement used, or I see it used as a last resort. Most often communities will apply what I call administrative enforcement. And this is done through the permitting process. You don't issue permits until you get what you need from the developer in terms of compliance to the ordinance. And it can also be done in terms of stop work orders if something is being done inappropriately on a site. And then finally, withholding certificates of occupancy if the minimum standards haven't been met. So rarely do I see builders being issued citations or dragged in front of judges in terms of enforcement, but the administrative approach is most effective. Conflicts and severability is a section of the ordinance that sustains remaining sections of the ordinance if parts of the ordinance were tested in court for constitutionality. So it's just a statement in the ordinance towards the end that just says, if any part of this ordinance is found unconstitutional, the remaining part still remains in place, and then effective date. So that's a quick and dirty of the types of sections. I wanted to spend a little bit more on the mechanics of ordinances, but first I wanted to throw this out in front of you. I know it's a lot of words. This is the city of Sandy Springs, that purpose section, and don't bother trying to read this now, but I wanted to point out a few things that they included. This is one of the nicest purpose sections that have ever been written, I think, because it immediately jumps to the fact that health and welfare and safety of the community is why the ordinance is being written. Most communities have the legislative authority to offer police powers for the health, safety, welfare of the community, which makes these ordinances legal, and Sandy Springs nailed it with that. They also establish administrative standards and best management practices, so they're right up front in the purpose statement saying that we are also going to have a complementary document that will guide the practice to accomplish the purpose of the ordinance. And then finally, they talk about maintenance and development of standards of land in a way that's consistent with community standards. They really define the purpose of the ordinance very well. They also run through a laundry list of benefits, describing how trees help the health of the community, and it's a very nice purpose statement. Ordinance mechanics. There's a couple of very important points. One is that it's important for the ordinance to be implemented in a way that's compatible with existing programs and processes. One of those processes is the zoning and rezoning process that most communities have. What this does is offer you the opportunity to reinforce and facilitate the ordinance with conditions to rezoning a property. So, for example, if you're in a county where you have a lot of exurban sprawl development and Target comes in and applies to rezone some agricultural land to commercial so they can build their store, a lot of times the community will allow the rezoning based on certain conditions. And a lot of times the conditions might apply to providing funding to support the construction of local schools, improving traffic conditions and signalization around the development project. But you could also put some conditions in there requiring them to comply with the terms and conditions of the tree ordinance. I've seen conditions that require developers to walk the sites with county or city arborists to discuss tree protection planning, and to also prepare some early drafts of tree protection plans while they're designing the project, so that you have the opportunity to design the project in a way that might be more compatible with trees, better space for trees. So you start tree protection early in the planning stage of a project. So the zoning process helps out a lot. And then finally, the permitting. A lot of things go on during permitting that could also help with the tree protection process. It might give you the ability to work with traffic engineers, stormwater engineers, sewer engineers to change the center line of roads, for example, to give a specimen tree a little bit more space, or to redirect the direction of a sanitary sewer outfall so they can miss a particularly nice stand of trees. So in the permitting process, if you could create some dialogue with the other engineers and the planners, you could create a better standard of practice for tree protection. It offers you better opportunities rather than coming in with a project that's already designed and you have no way to move the lines and help the trees. I mentioned several times the value of administrative standards and guidelines and practices, and here is a set of information that is usually contained within those practices. Guidelines and practices on tree protection and special encroachment, ways to get closer to trees and mitigate the damage or perhaps prevent it. Planning checklists, I'll show you an example of one of those in a minute. Planting requirements. You could have some pretty robust planting requirements that would include spacing, species selection, soil volume, details, things like that. References to arboricultural standards of practice. In this case, we have a picture up of the A300 standards, and they're supporting best management practices. And then finally, the coverage requirements are provided in the administrative standards as well. So once again, I'm going to drop the presentation to my desktop and show you some examples. And again, Leslie, if you can coach me through this, I want to make sure that they're visible.
Okay. I see the handout.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, this is 104%. Is that visible?
Yeah, you want to scroll a little bit. Yeah, no, that works.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. I might drop it smaller. Oops, sorry. This is the City of Decatur's Tree Conservation Plan checklist. This is the checklist, and this is one of the handouts that you have that the city uses when plans are submitted to them for construction. And I'll just go through this very quickly so you can see the types of review that they provide. Identification of protected trees, location and spatial definitions, and this includes the footprint of the structure, where all the underground utilities are going, placement of erosion control fencing, tree protection design, tree protection fencing design, staging areas for equipment and debris, things like that. This spatial requirement also requires the design, or the builder has to show where the critical root zone is of every tree based on its size. You could see that up here where it shows structural root plate table, that's the part of the tree that provides the majority of support, and the city has some very strict requirements about how close you can get to these structural roots. But they also define critical root zones, and they like to see that on the plans, as well as canopy calculations and detailed drawings and specifications and planting. So these checklists are pretty comprehensive, but they follow the requirements that are presented within the administrative standards. So the second thing I wanted to show you was the city species list. And again, tell me how well you can see this. Leslie, is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. This list was adapted from the city of Athens. An urban forestry consultant named Connie had developed this list, and it's a good breakdown of species. There's hundreds of them, and it's presented by the one column that I really wanted to show you. Let's see if I can highlight this. Is this column right here? That column shows what the potential canopy could be for these trees at maturity by species. And that's an important point that'll come up a little bit later on. So species list, it shows recommended uses, physical characteristics, environmental characteristics, tolerances, and all of this builds into a rather robust tree planting program. So we'll go back to the presentation again, Leslie, if you can bring me back up.
Okay.
Okay. I kind of ran through this already, the Tree Conservation Plan checklist. That is one of your handouts, and this is just the summary of the type of information that I just reviewed. And this is what one of the tree plans looks like from the city of Decatur. I borrowed this from one of the builders. It doesn't have all the information because I couldn't bring it all up on the screen, but I'll try to highlight a few things. The arborist notes are just general notes that address some basic rules about protecting the trees from soil erosion and demolition details and the placement of dumpsters and any pruning that might have to occur for structures. This is the critical root zone of the tree that's being mapped out. Decatur uses 1 1/4 feet radius for every 1-inch diameter of the tree. So if the tree is a 10-inch diameter, Decatur says that the tree has a 12.5-foot radius critical root zone. Placement of tree protection fencing here and here, and also erosion control features. Every root zone is mapped out. Every tree is numbered, and then there's a series of canopy calculations. Decatur's a canopy-based ordinance, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. So every tree is numbered, its size, species, condition, critical root zone, canopy, and then there's a canopy calculation that's done for the entire lot. And I'll get into all this canopy stuff in a while. And then the planting schedule, standard details. So this is a typical single-family home tree protection plan for the city of Decatur. Now I want to talk a little bit more about Canopy because I think that Canopy works very well for us and it's a very useful tool. Historically, early in the mid-'80s and on into the '90s till around 2000, a lot of tree ordinances, especially here in Georgia, applied a tree density calculation for their plant back requirements. In other words, it was based on the number of sticks per acre or number of trees per acre. It was a volume-based approach. And that approach came out of an ordinance that was written in Fulton County back in the mid-1980s that tried to apply an ecological approach to tree preservation. In other words, that ordinance said, the Fulton County ordinance back in the mid-'80s said, you have to have X number of trees per acre to start recovering the ecological benefits from those trees. Well, in time, we realized that Canopy is the most measurable and useful tool because with Canopy, we can also quantify the ecological benefits and we can measure canopy very easily. So Decatur adopted a canopy-based approach, and what they require is that multifamily and non-residential properties have to establish a minimum of 46% canopy at the time of permitting. Decatur's canopy was, in 2000, was 51%, and we did a canopy analysis again from 2004 data, I believe, and it was down to 46%. So what the second bullet shows is that they established a no net loss for canopy on a site at the time of tree removal. So it's a no net loss policy. If you have 10,000 square feet of tree canopy on a site and you develop that site, you have to bring 10,000 square feet of canopy back. And then, of course, as you're developing a site, you don't have as much space for trees, so they also established a tree bank. So if you're removing 10,000 square feet of canopy and you only have room for 5,000 square feet, you can pay up to 50% of that canopy to a tree fund within the city. And then the city uses that money to plant trees in streets and parks. So, you know, they're still maintaining the zero net loss policy. And then their final requirement is that a minimum of 25% of the existing canopy must be conserved. That's one requirement that they're running into trouble with a little bit. They didn't think that one through. If a lot has one tree and that tree's right in the middle of the buildable portion of the lot, the tree obviously has to come down to build a house or a commercial establishment. This rule can't be met. So they're struggling with that one a little bit. What they do is attribute canopy credits for types of species. So if you're a large growing tree like a Nuttall oak or a water oak that's capable of growing to 2,000, 3,000 square feet of canopy over its lifetime, they will give that builder credit of 1,600 square feet at the time of planting for a 2-inch caliper oak tree. I hope that makes sense to everybody. So a very small tree would be like a crepe myrtle or a dogwood that's capable of 150 to 200 square feet of canopy. At the time of planting, they would get credit for that species. So that's the way the canopy thing works. Canopy is very easy to calculate on a site. There's a couple of ways that it's been done. One is to simply go out and measure it. And the canopy is just the area of a circle. Of course, tree crowns aren't perfectly circular, so what we do is take the average of two diameters from the widest point of the tree and then the diameter that's perpendicular to the widest point, and then take that average and divide it by 2 so you have a radius, and then you just go through the area of a circle formula. One approach that I like in particular is the use of open available mapping. This is called Decatur One Map, where you can download aerial photographs on your computer and actually measure the area of a pixel that gives you the area in square meters or square feet, so you can measure the actual canopy coverage of a lot from the sky using this. A lot of communities are using this type of GIS mapping online, making it available to their citizens, and it's a very useful tool. I guess I can pause just for a second to see if there's any questions before I move on to the adoption process, because I moved through this material pretty quickly. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw them up on the screen or in the Q&A box, and I'll answer them. The adoption process, I found probably one of the most difficult things about tree ordinances, building consensus and collaboration across the community and dealing with the politics. People feel very passionate about their trees, and a lot of times they don't understand the difficulties involved with tree protection ordinances, and a lot of builders and developers feel threatened by more and more regulation because it affects their bottom line and it makes it difficult to build their houses. So a few tips to building consensus as you move into a tree ordinance adoption process. It's very important to share everything openly. Nothing behind the scenes, no secrets. Try to bring all the stakeholders in and communicate openly what you want to accomplish. And early on, try as hard as you can to define common interests. The city of Decatur, again, using them as a case study, a lot of the builders live in the community, and they're part of the community. They're business people in the community, and they want the best thing, but they want to make sure they do it right. So they're definitely engaged in the process. Building consensus requires dedicated leadership, and it also requires an established set of operating principles, including rules on how you make decisions as a group, and how you define issues, and how you define approaches to saving trees on construction sites, along with alternatives and identified resources and barriers. It's important to identify the potential sources of conflict. Conflict is based on four things: values, threats to rights, allocation of resources, which could mean somebody getting credit or not getting credit and all the turf that's involved, and then agreement or disagreement on the approaches to solutions. And I came across this little conflict style chart which describes the source of conflict very well and ways to move conflict towards success. What this chart shows is on the vertical axis is what your own self-interest would be, concern for yourself, ranging from low on the bottom to high on the top. So if you, and then the horizontal axis shows concern for other people, low to the left and then high to the right. So if you're working on a tree ordinance adoption process and there's really nothing in it for you, you have no stake in it, and you don't really care about the rest of the community, you would probably be avoiding the whole process entirely. Makes sense. If you are a builder and you're worried how it's going to affect your business, but you don't really care about the rest of the community, you would tend to be more competitive. So, or ideally, if you're a builder and you have great concern for your business and a great deal of concern for your community, you would be a lot more collaborative. So the whole idea in understanding this chart is to move your community in this direction, from compromise towards collaboration. And I think that knowing this up front helps you work through the process in a way that deals with those issues. This next slide is directed more towards those that are in an advocacy role, and that's how you deal with politics, because politics can surprise you a lot of times in a tree ordinance process. There was once I was working on a tree ordinance for, it seemed like probably 18 to 24 months. I was helping a local community, and it got to a point where we were ready to put it in front of the city council, and the city manager just said, we're going to table this for a couple years. Something happened politically that made it easier for them to slide this under the desk and forget about it. So, gather your
there's a question about, besides canopy credit, can you describe other approaches to required metrics like soil volume or square feet available for brooding?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in terms of tree cover, canopy standards are going to become the definitive way in the future. The Decatur ordinance does have a soil volume requirement, a minimum soil volume requirement for every tree, which the city itself doesn't follow at this point. But I can't remember what it is, but it's something like a minimum of 1,200 cubic feet of soil for every large shade tree. And I think that's pretty important, and that also goes back to your best management practices and your A300 standards. So those standards and practices are industry consensus. In other words, the industry sits around a table and decides what's best for the trees. And the more you can do to incorporate those standards into your ordinance, I think you'll have a healthier, more resilient urban forest. So I hope that answers the question. I don't think in terms of tree coverage, the density coverage or volume coverage of trees is going to be as effective as canopy is, or will be more into the future, because canopy is so measurable, and we have linked canopy to ecosystem services. So here's a list of points on dealing with politics. We don't need to really work it through, but this is being recorded, and you can take this PowerPoint presentation and think about some of these bullets. One of the most important points is find an elected official who's really sympathetic to your cause and willing to stay in it for the long haul. The other thing is do your homework. Have people that understand trees and understand building and understand the permitting process and all the mechanics there with you to help work through the process. Some keys to success with an ordinance once it's being implemented. Again, I made this point earlier on, but integrating with other disciplines is critically important. I've been able to save a lot more trees because we're able to move setback lines and change center lines of highways and require undisturbed buffers. It's really effective. A couple of other, if you're working for a local level of government, service orientation is important. It's the worst thing for an effective tree ordinance is to have a builder wait 3 weeks to get a permit or to get plan review comments back. Anything you can do to flip stuff back to them, meet them out on the site when they ask you to, and have that good dialogue, I think really helps with the process. Flexibility is critical. Sometimes you have to make field decisions, and the thing about ordinances is that they tend to be rigid. I've seen some communities where the rigidity just makes it impossible for builders to get through processes, and sometimes you just have to look at the situation and say, you know what, that tree's just not going to make it that much longer anyway. Why don't we go ahead and take it down, and you can do what you need to do, and we'll plant, we'll get some other trees planted back. Sometimes rigidity does pay off. Sometimes I've seen trees removed that should not have been removed, and so that dialogue is important. And demonstrating results. One thing that is important to sustain community support over the long haul is to talk about the effectiveness of your tree ordinance. So using Decatur as a case study again, there's a requirement in the ordinance that the city report on canopy changes in that community every 5 years. And the city's environmental sustainability board is vigilant over that. They want to see how effective the ordinance is and whether or not it needs to be revised or if it's humming along and doing the work it's supposed to do. Some additional take-home thoughts. Surround yourself with a legion of champions. I think if you can get a bunch of people in your community advocating for a tree ordinance, you'll have a lot more success. Pay attention to details, especially mechanics. Draw pictures, Venn diagrams, how's this whole process going to work, and try to visualize it out in the field. Build flexibility into your ordinance. I've said this several times. It's hard sometimes when you've adopted an ordinance and it's a very long, hard, contentious process. The last thing City Council wants to do is go back and revise it because you've made some mistakes. But if you build flexibility into it, they won't have to see it for a while. And then, as I suggested, if the City of Decatur comes back after 10 years and says, wow, we're really, the net loss policy isn't working because our canopy is now down to 41%, we need to revise it. And at that point, it's appropriate because you have data and statistics that says, well, our zero net loss isn't working. We have to bump it up to zero net loss plus 5 or something. So we can start bringing the canopy back up to an appropriate level. And then finally, document everything you do and communicate results. So with that, I'll close and thank you all for being so patient with the technology. And I think we have about 15 minutes if we do want to field some questions. I went through some of this material pretty quickly.
Yeah, so again, if you do want to ask a question, just go in the Q&A dialog box located in the top left of the computer and type your question, and we'll read them out. And Ed will have a few minutes to respond. And while people are sending in questions, I just wanted to draw your attention back to the fact that the handouts that Ed referred to are on the, you can download them on the top right. You see the 3-piece paper. If you click on that, it'll show you all of the handouts attached to this webinar, 3 of which Ed referred to, and then I posted a couple that were specific to North Carolina, but I think would hold relevance in any part of the country, one specific to tree protection ordinances. So do please remember to download those handouts. But we did get a question, Ed. It says, does the regulatory section refer to the administrative?
Yes. Yes. In every ordinance that I've worked with that took that bilateral, those dual document approaches, there is a section in the regulatory section that says, shall comply with the administrative standards established herein. So those standards are part of the ordinance. I'm going to share my screen one more time because there is a document that I did want to share with the group, and I kind of skipped through it. And I think it's an important point. So tell me how this looks again visually, Leslie. And tell me if it's visible.
That looks good.
Okay.
That looks good.
This is a boundary tree agreement, and Decatur started working with these because we have had a lot of infill development where existing houses are demolished and the newer, larger houses on the smaller lots are built. Quite often, the pre-existing house would be a small bungalow, maybe built in, prior to the 1940s, some post-World War II development, and trees were often planted close to the property line. So if you can envision a 33-inch water oak tree that's 3 feet on your property line, and I'm building a house with a 5-foot setback on my property line, I'm bound to get into those roots. That tree might have a 45, 50-foot critical root zone, and I'm impacting between 25 and 30% damage to your tree. Well, historically, when that happened, the builder would build a house. A lot of times they're spec houses. New homeowner moves in. The neighbor's tree dies, and the neighbor's left holding the bag. Dead tree in a very difficult location because it's all built around now. And eventually it's an $8,000 to $10,000 tree removal. So it was something that we had to pay attention to in the city. And we came up with this boundary tree language in the ordinance, as well as this requirement for an agreement that requires the builder to have the conversation with the neighbor and tell the neighbor, I'm damaging your tree, here's the calculated percentage of damage. The city agrees that we can mitigate the damage, and here's our prescription for mitigation, or we're considering the tree destroyed. So I, the builder, am going to remove the tree and let you plant the tree back in your property of your choice, as long as we meet the canopy requirement. If it's questionable as to whether or not the tree survives. The city will let the builder leave the tree, but post a bond that will cover the eventual costs for removal and replacement should the tree die. So either way, the neighboring homeowner who's being impacted won't be hit with the expense because of what the neighbor's doing. So I think this is kind of an interesting approach. It seems to have worked. A lot of builders don't like it, but they understand it. They understand that they're leaving an impact in the community, so they're living with it. So sorry for not bringing that up earlier.
No, it's great you referred to it. We do have another question. It says, are administrative and BMP components typically easier to modify, i.e. without council adoption?
Yes. They are because they're called administrative guidelines. And, you know, sometimes those standards, especially A300 standards, change, and it's a good idea to update your ordinance where you need to. I've seen some communities, just as a matter of precaution, bring the standards back to City Council and, you know, just say we've made some technical changes to the content and still ask for City Council blessing. You know, sometimes you're at the mercy of your city attorney or county attorney as well, whether or not they feel like it needs to be brought to a vote or not.
Okay. We have another question asking how to deal with existing dead trees on commercial or residential property that may cause damage to the public right-of-way.
Right. That could be dealt with in tree protection ordinances, but there's typically a nuisance tree ordinance that would complement the tree protection ordinance. They could be both contained in one document, and it's more of a comprehensive ordinance. But in City of Decatur's case, they do have a nuisance tree code that requires people to mitigate risk on their properties. So if there's a dead tree, the city will notify the property owner and tell them they have to remove the tree. If the property owner refuses, then they'll issue a citation, and the property owner gets to explain to a judge why they don't want to mitigate the risk.
Okay. And then someone brought to my attention that the handout you uploaded on there for tree conservation plan checklist, it's not, people aren't able to open it, and I had the same issue when I tried it as well.
Okay. I'll try to upload it again once we're through.
Okay. And what I can do for folks is I'm going to be sending out an evaluation, just a quick little 5-question survey to get everybody's opinion or thoughts on how this webinar went. But I'll also, in that email, I'll attach all of the handouts that were on this webinar so that you'll have them. So I didn't know if anybody had any other questions. I don't see any ones that are being added to the Q&A dialog box. If there are, I'll keep an eye on it. But before we go, sorry, did you have something else?
Yeah, I just uploaded it again, and it looks good now. So
okay, all right.
If folks want to access that checklist, it's there.
Okay, and then so we'll get those. All those handouts should be on there. Maybe I'll add it just in case somebody needs it when I send out the evaluations. But I wanted to, before we go, bring everybody's attention to, if you haven't registered for our upcoming webinar, this is part of a series. We've got 3 more coming after this, and the dates are here. We have one in February, March, and April. So if you haven't registered for those, please do so and keep them on your calendar, because I think there's going to be great topics to be covered. And I've put our website at the bottom of this slide here, so you can go there to register for each of those events. And as I said, I'm going to be emailing out an evaluation just to get everybody's opinion on how this webinar went, how the topic was covered. Then also there's a couple of areas where you can identify which topics you'd like to hear in future webinars. If we don't address it in 2016, we are hoping to continue the webinar series into the future. So please provide us your comments or your feedback on what you would like to hear, what would be most useful for you as a tree board member or as a tree board advocate or or whatever your role is with your community tree board. We'd like to get your opinion on what you need to hear more about or what topics you think are most relevant. So with that, if nobody has any additional questions, I'm just going to check real quick, make sure nobody does. Then I think we're good. Ed, thank you so much for your time, and thank everybody for attending. I hope you got some really useful information out of this that you're able to bring back to your community.
My pleasure, Leslie.
All right. Well, then, everybody have a wonderful Wednesday, and hopefully we'll see you back here next month. Dudley, if you're still on, I'm going to stop the recording.